So, I became the startup queen of ICICI, so to speak. But it wasn't because everything was thrown at me. It was, yes, I was shown opportunities, but a lot of other people said no because they did not want to move, especially the high performers. Many of them were happier to be leading a well-established business and team and a balance sheet rather than start from zero with no balance sheet, no team, and you build it out from base zero. So there was that fear. Many people have asked me why I don't have fear. Maybe because my father was in the army and he's actually fought 2 wars when we were at home and, waiting and praying. So beyond a point, you learn to face fear. So fear was not a question in my mind, but it was certainly a question, I guess, for others.
Over a storied career spanning more than 4 decades, Shikha Sharma became one of India's preeminent bankers. Through various pivotal roles, culminating in the position of MD and CEO at Axis Bank, Mrs. Sharma helped build the ICICI Group and Axis Bank into the companies we know today. I sat down with Mrs. Sharma to learn more about her journey and the lessons she learned through these experiences. If you haven't already, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Also, let me know in the comments what you think of this conversation and if there's any entrepreneurs or investors you think would be great guests to have on the podcast. Hi, Mrs. Sharma. Thank you so much for coming on. Welcome to the Sensei Kujaku show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So, Mrs. Sharma, there's something particularly interesting about your career, which is that you are one of the few people who has played a really pivotal role in building not one but 2 very meaningful and large institutions within the financial space in India. But before we get into how exactly you went about that and the role you played at each of these companies, I want to start with the start of your career and understand your thought process when you were graduating from business school and why you chose to go into banking.
So let me actually step back and say, going to IIM and before that, I did my BA in economics from LSR, but I was passionate about science and physics and maths. So I had a scientific mathematical frame of mind because our parents were pretty middle class and old fashioned at that point of time, and they didn't want me to go to a college very far from home. LSR was the college they wanted me to go to, and that didn't have science, so I ended up doing economics. So I ended up doing economics reluctantly, but I had that passion for science and maths, as I said. So it was kind of logical for me to focus on the maths courses at IIM and to look for roles which would leverage my inclination for maths. So banking looked like an obvious choice at that point. That's how simple it was.
What was it like being in business school at that point in terms of what people's plans were post graduating? So, for example, in recent times, everybody in business school wants to get into VC and PE. There was a phase when everyone wanted to become an investment banker. What was the hot, choice of career at that point?
So at that point, I think the top jobs on campus were consulting, were Tata Administrative Service, and the foreign banks or some of the other MNCs. So those were kind of the most sought after jobs, day one jobs.
I sort of try and connect the dots when you see someone, and especially in your case, because we have the advantage of seeing everything in hindsight.
Yeah.
And do you ever think about how differently life could have turned out just when you think of small individual incidents that happened?
Yeah.
For instance, the fact that you joined ICICI and not, say, SBI, for instance, and how one person's decision to hire a recent graduate affected so many things down the line. So what I want to understand is the importance of being a master of your own destiny when it comes to your career, and I suppose life more generally, and how one goes about not just going through life making lemonade, but actually actively pursuing whatever it is that you may be interested in.
So that's an interesting question, Krish. And as you said, with hindsight, if I think about things, you can plan stuff, but there are always things that are kind of outside your circle of influence, circle of control, and you have to really, I think, take it by the day and be willing to adapt and see what's the best course of action in that particular circumstance. So, as I said, I wanted to do physics. I thought I was going to be a physics researcher, but parents said, no, you go to LSR, and so I did economics. In the first year, I actually sulked, and I didn't focus on studies, and that kind of showed up in my results, which I regret. It was just stupid, because after that, I didn't make that mistake. That, if you did not get your top choice and you went to an alternative, whatever alternative you go into, you have to embrace and give your best to it. So after that, I don't think I did that mistake again, but at LSR I did. For the first year, as I said, just languish around. So here again, like the other students who passed out of IIM, I would have liked to join one of the hot jobs, go to an MNC bank. But I was an introverted person. I did not do well in interviews. So although I had a very strong academic record, I did not get placed for the first 2 weeks on campus, and that was like absolute disaster. And then ICICI came along, and I got through ICICI. I think they were more influenced by the academic record than the interview performance. And since then, I do believe that destiny has a path for you, and you don't know what it's going to be. And I was lucky, in hindsight, that I did not get one of the MNC bank jobs, and I got the ICICI job, because I don't think I would have had the privilege of the exposure that I had at ICICI. Domestic institution, narrowly focused at the point that I joined them. They were primarily in project finance, but as the economy threw up more opportunities, ICICI had diversified into a bunch of different areas in financial services. And being one of the few IIM graduates who joined at that point of time, we were lucky to be exposed to a lot of those opportunities and participate in a lot of those opportunities. I saw some of my other colleagues, very bright people, join the MNC banks, and I don't think they got the same width and scope of exposure that we did. The second thing about ICICI, which turned out to be very unique and different from a lot of other experience that my colleagues had, was on the way they embraced women at the workplace. So we were given the same pressures as our male colleagues, but I think the institution was accommodative and respectful of the fact that as a woman you couldn't just randomly be transferred around because you went as a couple. So they were more caring about transfers, number one. And during childbirth, I think ICICI in those days and time was a lot more flexible than any other institution. But most importantly, and I've talked about this story before, when I came back from maternity leave at ICICI, instead of saying, oh, she's come back from maternity leave, let's kind of accommodate her in some sidey role, they actually threw a challenge at me every time. The first time I came back from maternity leave after my son was born, ICICI asked me to set up a new financing group for the high-tech industry with a new World Bank line of credit that we had got. So what it does is when you come back to work and as a new mother, you are coping with that issue of should I leave my child behind at home and go to work or not, the travails with any new mother has. If your work is not challenging and interesting, then I think your choice leans in one direction. But because ICICI gave me a challenging role to do, I was engrossed in it and wanted to do it well and stayed the course. Many of my other friends, very bright ladies, went back and the organization kind of put them in a not very meaningful role, and they ended up moving on after a short while. Similarly, when I came back after Tusha was born, that's my second child, again I was put into a very exciting new venture where ICICI got into a JV with JP Morgan, and we were building out a modern investment bank. So I think that was truly unique about ICICI. And in hindsight, I think I was very lucky that I didn't get all those jobs I was craving for, but got ICICI instead.
Right. And it's interesting, as you describing your journey, you played a pivotal role in converting ICICI, which at that time, like you said, was predominantly focused on project financing, into a group where they, serviced all lines of financial requirements that customers may have. So, what was it like at that point through, say, the 70s, 80s, 90s, as you were building out these multiple businesses within the group? What was it like internally? Was there a lot of excitement? Was there some sense of fear of the unknown? Or what was it like actually being in the trenches at that point?
So there's a bit of everything, Krish. So first of all, I think ICICI was very lucky to have two visionary leaders who led ICICI during that period. Mr. Bagul, who is, he's recently been recognized for, once he wrote his book, the FM's book, about what a brilliant career he's had. And people respect him for the doyen that he's been in financial services. But what's unique about Mr. Bagul is he had the ability to look out decades and think about what the future may need and plan for it and start seeding institutions for what the future may need. And as I said, true visionary. And after Mr. Bagul, we had Mr. Kamath, who very entrepreneurial, very tech savvy, very with the times, and a great learner. So we had two great leaders who were willing to make the investments required for a evolving India. And I was lucky that I ended up working with both of them. When Mr. Bagul joined ICICI, he set up a small group to do strategic planning for the institution. Mr. Kamath led that group, and I was a member of that group. So I managed to work with both of them on strategy, and I guess that's how, when new businesses happen, I was given the opportunity and I was willing to take it. So the issue of, was there excitement, was there future thinking? Yes, there was. Was there fear? There was. So I became the startup queen of ICICI, so to speak. But it wasn't because everything was thrown at me. It was, yes, I was shown opportunities, but a lot of other people said no, because they did not want to move, especially the high performers. Many of them were happier to be leading a well-established business and team and a balance sheet rather than start from zero with no balance sheet, no team, and you build it out from base zero. So there was that fear. Many people have asked me why I don't have fear. Maybe because my father was in the army, and he's actually fought 2 wars when we were at home and, waiting and praying. So beyond a point, you learn to face fear. So fear was not a question in my mind, but it was certainly a question, I guess, for others. So as I said, there was vision, there was excitement, there was empowerment, and there was fear. All of that had a role to play.
So that's a really interesting point that you actually bring up, which is that a lot of people tend to maybe in some sense get slightly complacent sometimes in a job and may not be willing to push the envelope. How important do you think it was to your career that you went above and beyond the call of duty? It wasn't just about showing up and doing whatever work fell on your desk that day, but it was about, like you said, being entrepreneurial, even though you were technically working within an organization. You weren't running your own firm. So how important and how critical was it that you did far more than what was maybe necessarily expected of you?
So, Krish, I would not phrase it that way, because I think there are many others who gave their very best to ICICI and went beyond just showing up and doing their duty. I think where I had a different inclination was this willingness to take risk and being an entrepreneur within an institutional framework. I was willing to do that, which maybe was different from some of the others. It was certainly important for my career growth and learning, because I wouldn't have got those opportunities if I didn't have that risk-taking capacity. Having said that, Did I go all the way and truly have the appetite to go out on my own and do something? I thought about it. I thought about it twice in my career, but did not have the guts. So that's one big difference that I see between students at our time and now. Um, you asked me a question earlier on what did people want to do on campus at that time, and everybody wanted to, as I said, join a consulting firm or an MNC bank or Tata Administrative Services. Today, there is a much higher proportion of people who want to go out and set up their own business. And I think that's very exciting, and I think it's very good for the future of India that we have that much more entrepreneurial appetite today than we did in our time.
You spoke about two people who played an important role in your life, in your career. I want to understand from your perspective, as you yourself grew and over time more and more people were under your wing, what did you learn about being a boss? How important was it to balance being a friend but also being a boss? And did you have challenges in terms of putting your foot down when it needed to be done? Or what were some of the challenges and things you learned as a boss?
So I think, because of the kinds of roles I did, which were a lot of startup stuff, starting a new business. I think what I found important is that you gather a bunch of people around you, and I was fortunate that I could build my own teams in a lot of the early part of my career. So you should gather around you a bunch of people who share your values and who bring different skills to the table and who are all willing to challenge each other. I think those are three elements that are important in building a high-performing team. Because if you have people with different values, as in, when I'm saying values, I mean, do they care about building for the long term or the short term? Where does the customer versus the producer come into play? What's their balance of thinking on that? What's their balance of, how do you deal with employees? How important is it to have transparency and fairness when you're dealing with employees? There has to be some commonality on all of that, otherwise it's going to be very difficult to manage the team. Of course, you need diversity of skills, because without that, how will you build a new business? And you need to have open challenge, because when you're starting out, you want to get the best of breed of thinking and experience, and it's not going to be possible to extract that if people don't come out and talk openly about what they want. So that's something which I kind of internalized quite early. One of the good things for me was that ICICI threw me into setting up businesses which I knew nothing about. So I was thrown into setting up investment banking, I was thrown into setting up retail finance, I was thrown into setting up insurance. So I had no choice but to say that I will try and gather this set of people around me, and together we will craft what we want to do. So the first time that happened, it happened because of necessity, but I realized the power of doing that. That if you can co-create a vision and then deliver to it, there's nothing more powerful than that, because that's when you really get the power of the team, because everybody sees that they are a part of the future and they're crafting the future. So that was a very important lesson for me. That co-creation, not as something that you put out there on the board, but as something that you live every day, is very critical. Having common values and articulating them and talking about them is important, because when you make choices, you make them against those values, and choices become easier to digest if everybody understands what is the template that you're working off. Then to your question of friendships versus tough decisions. As I said, co-creation is important, but there are times when you have a point of view and you feel very strongly about that point of view. Then I think as a leader you have to recognize that you got to go with your point of view, because you carry the can. So where you're not sure, I think co-creation is important. But you feel very strongly about something, then I think you have to be transparent and say that I feel strongly about it. So this time around, you're going to do it my way, but you have to do it the way you think, and you have to be able to talk about it transparently.
There's one thing that I see when you sort of look back at people's careers and people who've had storied careers, especially if they've tasted success fairly early on in their career.
Yeah.
How do you manage, how do you deal with that? Because I imagine it's quite easy to let that get to your head. It's quite easy to develop an ego and think that you walk on water, and you sometimes surpass people who are older than you, more senior than you. So how did you ensure that you didn't let it get to your head, and that complacency or the ego didn't set in and affect your decision making and your work more generally?
So Krish, if I have to be candid, I'm sure ego came in the way sometimes. But I would think that the majority of time, I probably didn't allow it to overtake what I was thinking. And I think it was fundamentally the principle. I don't remember if it was my father-in-law who said that or my father. Both were government servants, but both of them always said that, look, you have to remember कि ये कुर्सी का कमाल है. जब तक you're sitting on the kursi, you have some power. When you step off that kursi, all that power goes away. So remember that every day, and you will stay grounded, because it's very important to be ready for when you give up work and move on. So that's something that I would tell myself consciously every day, that look, I am in this because I'm doing this job and I'm in this role, and all the power I have, I derive from being in this role. It's not about me, it's about the role. And then you're able to exercise the power, but distance it from you as an individual. I think I did that most of the time, maybe not all the time.
Right. And if you look at the banking business, or I suppose financial services more generally, say in the 80s versus what it is today or in recent times, how do you think that business has evolved? So one aspect is, of course, there's a lot more competition, especially on the private side. But in terms of what it means to actually be a competent, good, successful bank and banker, do you think that has actually changed in any meaningful way, or is it pretty much what it was then?
So I think two things that haven't changed and are not going to change when it comes to banking. One is risk. I think you cannot be a good banker if risk doesn't come first, and if you don't understand what risk is about. It could be market risk, it could be credit risk, it could be operational risk, it could be regulatory, reputation, bunch of things. But we see stories every day on some bank or the other. One of these risks went out of control, and the story stopped with midway or was cut short completely. So risk has always been important and will continue to be important when it comes to banking and financial services. The second thing is the customer. I think not just banking, broader financial services, any consumer service actually, understanding what the customer needs and catering to the customer's needs in a transparent way and a sustainable way is important. You can't just burn money and cater to the customer, but you can't rip off the customer by not giving them value for money. Both those things are not going to create sustainable businesses. So I think understanding customers, understanding their needs and being able to serve them sustainably is an important part of banking and financial services, since we are ultimately a consumer business. But what has changed between then and now? What has changed is two things. I think the pace of change in the world is much higher today than it was when I started to work. So again, it's something that I have talked about in the past, that when I joined ICICI and we were in project finance, we used to do project lending and try and project out cash flows for 10-15 years, and we thought we could do it in a deterministic fashion. Today it's so hard to do that. There's so many moving parts. Regulation can change, customer habits can change, technology can change, financial markets can change. So it's just a bunch of different things going on, and therefore it's difficult to have a deterministic plan. You still have to have a broad goal because otherwise you're not grounded, but you have to be flexible about the path to where you're going to get there. So I think flexibility of operating models is a lot more important today, and for bankers to assess when their clients have that and when they don't, and serving their customers appropriately based on that. The tenor of services you provide has to reflect that ability to assess is important from a managing change perspective. Your own business model has to reflect the ability to manage change. And technology, I think technology has just evolved so much that a lot of things that we were not able to do then, you can do today with the power of technology and with the power of data. So I think those are the big changes that have happened, and every business needs to evolve to them, but certainly banking needs to evolve to that too.
So now I want to talk about a very important point in your career, which is when you got a call saying there's an opening at Axis Bank and would you be interested in the job? What was it? What was your thought process at that time? What were some questions that you may have had in your mind? Fears, excitement. What was it like at that moment in your mind, and what was your thought process when you were deliberating that decision?
So there were two things actually. I had by then served almost 3 decades in the ICICI Group, and I had been in ICICI Prudential for almost a decade, having built out that business from the beginning. So I had done a lot of what ICICI had to offer me, and to that extent I was kind of, in a sense, plateauing as far as ICICI was concerned. And here was another institution which was which had a very strong, trustworthy brand, very good parentage, had built a couple of strong franchises around government services, payments businesses, consumer deposits, but still had a lot to do. And I had been a builder of businesses, so I was very attracted by this opportunity to go and build again, because that's what I enjoyed doing. I knew that I enjoyed doing building. I had not done managing a large, business, and so I didn't know how much I would enjoy that, but I knew that I would enjoy building. So an opportunity which allowed me to do build outs was very exciting. So that was the plus side of it. The scary bit was, all my career I had been in the same institution. So I knew the culture, I knew the people. And not only had I been with the same institution, I had worked in businesses where I had built my own teams. So I'd had the flexibility to learn over a period of time, work with people over a period of time, grow together. And here I was going to be plonked on the top of an institution where I knew nothing about the culture, I knew nothing about the people, and I had to lead a set of people who I'd never worked with before. So that was really the scary bit. Also, of course, with hindsight, not so much with foresight, in ICICI, while I had led the setting up the retail financing business and I had run the life insurance company, which was an independent company within the group, I always had the cover of the umbrella of the group, and we were not a listed entity. When I moved to Axis, that was a big difference, which I don't think I understood the nuance of it completely when I went in. That if you go and become the head of an institution with no group coverage, you're really on your own. And it is a step-up function in terms of the way you have to manage and you deal with the environment. So,
what were the pressures like in that kind of job? There's obviously external pressures in the form of there's shareholders who want to return, there's obviously the customers who deal with you every day. But I imagine there's also, in some sense, an internal pressure that you put on yourself to make sure that you do your best, that you don't want to be seen as anything other than a raging success. And this, I imagine, is any person in that position would have that. So how did you actually manage those pressures? Was it ever overwhelming, or were you just so used to it at that point that you could deal with it?
So by that time, it is true that I had done a couple of build outs. So some of that pressure of, I have to prove to the world that I'm a raging success, I don't think I really had it, Krish, because I had reached the stage where I'd said, I've been there, I've done that, I've proven to the world enough, and now I only have to be comfortable that I think I'm giving my best and I'm doing that honestly every day, and wasn't really looking out for validation from the external world. So I think that was very helpful from a managing pressure perspective. The second thing was, just given the kinds of experiences that I'd had in the roles that I'd done, I mentioned this earlier, I did not know anything about a lot of the businesses that I built out. So I was always conscious of the fact that what got created was a group effort. And I knew that I had some strengths and I had some weaknesses. So I was not going to get everything right. I was going to make mistakes, and it was okay to make mistakes as long as I was willing to accept them and change and move on. So the internal pressure was not there for anything which was material or which really came in the way of any delivery. But of course, again, as I said a little while ago, it was the first time that I had no umbrella cover, right? So I was out there on my own, and managing the environment is a very important part of that role. And that's something I had not done adequately before. So I think that was the new challenge for me.
And your time at Axis Bank, I think one of the most obvious changes that took place over that time was an increasing focus on the retail side of banking.
Yeah.
And you and the team at that time is, credited with making Axis a much more retail-focused bank than it was prior to you joining. So, what was the thought process at that time as to why did you think that it was vital that you moved in that direction, or was there even thought that we're on the right path anyway, we don't necessarily need to change?
You had asked me the question, why did I find Access exciting and what were the fears? And as I said earlier, what was exciting to me about Access was the opportunity to build. And when I was talking about the opportunity to build, it was not just a philosophy statement. Even when I went in for the interviews with the selection committee of the board, I had thought about what build would mean in that context. And to me, what build would mean was this was a trusted brand, established institution, which had built certain capabilities. But if you look at the stature of the institution, it was one of the 3-4 most respected names, and therefore had the right to play in a wider gamut. It had actually not built out some of those other capabilities, and one big capability was the consumer lending business, because that was an obvious need for the country. It was a segment which was going to continue to grow, and since we had a strong brand and we had the branch network, we had the right to play in it. So even before I joined the institution, that was an opportunity that stared you in the face of something that this institution had a right to do and win in. It also, of course, from a risk perspective, diversified risk, because then you didn't have all your lending risks sitting in the corporate or infrastructure bucket. You had a bunch of other credit risks that you could diversify into. So that was something that was a natural extension, as I said. And the second thing which I felt there was a need to build out was technology. Axis had fairly strong, IT processing systems. But if I compared with some of the leading edge tech capability in India or globally, I think there were gaps in terms of the customer facing technology, and therefore the IT architecture that would allow you to do that just becoming much more online, real time. So I think that was the other investment that was required, and I think we did those two quite well. We also saw infrastructure as an opportunity which did not play out that well because of the credit risk it created on the books. But I think consumer and tech were certainly big opportunities and things that I'd done before. So I had a degree of confidence in how to build it and what mistakes to avoid. So I think that was good in hindsight.
And so Warren Buffett likes to say that there are more banks than there are bankers. So in having obviously done it yourself, what do you think separates the good from the great in banking? I take it's par for the course to work hard and be dedicated and be honest, and I take all that for granted. But what do you think sets apart the 1% from the 0.1%? There must be something above and beyond the obvious that makes them that.
So I think this horse sense for risk is very important in a banker. I would think that the two critical horse senses which are required are for risk and for where the consumer is and where the consumer is going, so that you can build for those two. I think that's what differentiates bankers. And then of course it's a very people business. So the ability to lead people is critical. And the fourth, which I think has become absolutely necessary today, is technology. Because banking has become so intertwined with technology today that you have to have an understanding of it and you have to have comfort with thinking about how to leverage technology to deliver services to consumers.
And you spoke about, at least initially in your career, and I suppose when you were in college, that you were a fairly reserved person. Yeah. So did you find that people aspect challenging, at least initially? And do you think you evolved on that front materially over time?
So, so there are two aspects to that people front. I think because I'm a transparent person, in fact, in a lot of my people assessments, I was told that, it was probably a leadership weakness for me that I'm too transparent. People can read my face. So that could be seen as a weakness, but it's also a strength because when you're transparent, you find it easier to build relationships. People know where you're coming from and what you see is what you get. So that was helpful from a people perspective. The second that helped from a people perspective is that I really didn't have much of an ego, in the sense that I didn't think I needed to have all the answers and I didn't believe that I had all the answers. So I could genuinely partner with people and co-create. I think that helped me with people. What has been not a strength area, in fact a weakness area, has been this whole fact that yes, I'm introverted, I don't like to do public speaking, I don't like to stand up and energize a room full of people. So that's always been a challenge for me. I used to be terrible at it because my job needed me to do it. I would practice and I would get headaches every time I had to do it because I was so stressed trying to do it. But just by having to repeatedly do it, I got a little better over time. It's never been my strength area. It is not my strength area even today, but you have to do what you have to do sometimes.
Right. And you spoke about an important aspect of being a banker is understanding where the puck is going, not just where it is. And another important sort of movement of Axis Bank during your tenure was an increasing focus on the new India. And what I mean by that is not only younger customers, but the more ambitious, aspirational India. And an important part of that was actually a branding campaign that became quite famous at the time, called with Deepika Padukone and Baddi Ka Naam Zindagi. And so how did you think about positioning of Axis Bank in what was already a somewhat crowded space at that time on the retail side of the business? How did you go about differentiating yourself to the man on the street to say that, look, why don't you try us out as well?
Since the focus was on building out the retail business, and the cards business is a very important part of building out a retail franchise, we thought hard about, if we have to spend money on advertising, what is the one product that you will spend money on, which will then bring everything along. And therefore it was a calculated call to say, let's go with cards. Because cards are in the pocket of the customer, so there's a strong brand reminder, and cards get used at points where customers are engaged with that activity, right? If you're going shopping or you're going eating or you're going on a holiday, then you're using your card. So if you can engage customers in those things where they are otherwise emotionally engaged, then you could get some rub-off benefit of it. So that was the thinking, that therefore let's go with card as the big product behind which we build the brand, because you can't build a brand around 1,000 products. We just didn't have the money to do that. So while we had a lot of other services, we had a lead product as far as branding is concerned. So I think that worked well for us, and Deepika was a bit of a gamble, but we wanted to go with someone who would, who was one, affordable, two, was going to create an aspirational image, and who would still be seen as homely, trustworthy, which is what Axis was. So I think it worked well for both.
Right.
The brand ambassador and the brand, I think.
Right. Yeah, no, 100%. I think they both evolved, and you caught her right at the cusp of her big breaks.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Sharma, I just want to end with one question. I'm going to ask you to reflect on your career.
Yeah.
In, say, roughly 4 decades of working, you would have experienced a lot, met lots of people. What do you think were 1 or 2 key lessons that you learned about people and working with people? And also, what is your overwhelming feeling when you look back at your career? Is it pride? Is it satisfaction? Or is it something else?
So let me take that second question first, because that's easy to answer. Yeah, and it's going to sound cheesy when I say this, but genuinely what I feel is a sense of gratitude more than anything else. Because when I look back to who I was, I came from a middle class family, as I said. My father was a very committed armed forces officer, but I had no exposure to business. I think a lot of the breaks I got were very lucky breaks, and that's why I do believe that destiny has a path for you, and it has a big role to play in success. So we can't attribute all the success to yourself. There is a bunch of other things out there which get you success. I think I was very fortunate to have worked with some great leaders who gave me space, who allowed me to make mistakes, and who I learned a lot from by just watching. I talked about Mr. Vagul, I talked about Mr. Kamath, also Mark Tucker, who led Prudential at that time, and I was lucky to be a part of the JV and watch him very closely. I think I just got very lucky to have worked closely with leaders who had actually different skills, and so I could learn different things from them. And I got lucky with teams who worked with me, who were willing to give their everything to the role along with me, and that's why we got the success that we did. So when you have so much to be grateful for, that is the overwhelming feeling that I look back. Your other question in terms of what have I learned about people? Frankly, very hard to encapsulate in one thing, Krish, but I think, with people, and maybe I'm saying this because I believe that's my strength area, that building trusting relationships with people is very important. I believe that transparency is not a weakness, it is a strength, because it enables you to build that trust. And if you have the trust, then you can be confrontational in a conversation, you can disagree in a conversation, but if you have trust, people know where you're coming from. And that is so important, that you would do everything to build on it and not destroy it.
Right. Well, Mrs. Sharma, thank you so much for taking the time again. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.
Absolutely, Krish. I think it was really fun chatting with you, and hope we'll get a chance to connect again.
Definitely. Thank you.